In the year 1945, everyone already knew that Germany was going to lose the war. The Allied forces were approaching Berlin, the last Nazi stronghold from the west, while the Soviets were sweeping through the territory from the east. The city was being bombed daily. Its population was in panic, its troops demoralized, and opinions among the German high command were divided. Hitler and his most loyal men still believed in a miraculous victory, while their more pragmatic generals began to form plans for escape or surrender. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about the confrontation that marked the end of the Second War in Europe, the Battle of Berlin in full color. Since the end of the Battle of Stalingrad in February 1943, German forces had begun to lose territory. The Soviets were advancing through previously conquered countries at great speed. Combined with the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944, Germany's situation was desperate. Adolf Hitler was behaving increasingly erratically, issuing orders he would later contradict or demanding impossible feats from his generals. The Führer knew that his only chance of victory was to catch the Allies off guard. In December 1944, Germany launched what would be its last major offensive. Known as the Battle of the Bulge, Axis troops managed to surprise their enemies and break through the stagnant front. But the Allies were able to contain the advance, and a month later, the attack had ended. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire Second World War. The German army suffered over 75,000 casualties, and its air force was extremely weakened. From this clash, the Nazis began a retreat that would not stop until the end of the war. Let's now listen to a historian talk about this battle.
The German attack in the Ardennes could have hit a number of U.S. units, but it hit a completely green one, and that unit melted away in the face of the German attack, and now there's a hole where the U.S. defenses used to be.
But despite the clearer path, Berlin was no longer a target for the Allies. They knew the Soviets were closing in, and believed that if both armies attacked the city simultaneously, there would be a great risk of friendly fire. Eisenhower, the leader of the Allied forces in Europe, had promised Stalin he could have the city. Discarding plans for a ground operation, they resorted to aerial bombardment. Starting from 1945, American and British planes began an extensive series of over 80 air raids. At one point, the Royal Air Force bombed the city for 36 consecutive days. The damage caused was extensive. Massive fires destroyed much of the buildings. Tens of thousands of Berliners died, and many more found their homes destroyed. Despite this, the greatest danger for the Germans came from another direction. The Soviets, fueled by a terrible thirst for revenge, were rapidly advancing along the Eastern Front, which stretched over 1,000 kilometers long. By mid-1944, they were already in Poland, the last stop before entering Germany. As they marched, the Soviets encountered evidence of the brutal war crimes perpetrated by the Nazis. In 1944, the first concentration camp, Lublin Majdanek, was liberated. Although it had been evacuated, the Germans did not have time to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. Thousands of prisoners were still there, living witnesses to the atrocities committed by the Nazis. From these discoveries, the chief of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, ordered that all prisoners in camps who could be liberated by the Soviet advance had to be transported inland to the Reich. This was not only because the Germans needed prisoners for forced labor, but also because they did not want more evidence of their crimes to fall into the hands of their enemies. But there was also another secret reason. Himmler suspected that Germany had no chance of winning the war anymore. The Nazi leader thought that, if necessary, he could use the detainees as hostages, bargaining chips with the Allies. Hitler couldn't find out. Any German showing a defeatist spirit risked being shot. The first transports of prisoners were carried out by trains or ships. However, as winter approached, they began to be done on foot. These transfers became known as the death marches. The detainees, weakened by months or years of inhuman conditions, malnourished and beaten, often could not endure the journey. SS guards were ordered to kill those who were unable to keep walking. Thousands were murdered during these marches. Many others died of hunger, exhaustion, or exposure to cold and snow. In January 1945, the most infamous of these marches took place. 9 days before the Soviets reached Auschwitz, 55,000 prisoners were forced to walk 56 kilometers in the harsh Polish winter. Between 9,000 and 15,000 died or were murdered. The survivors were sent to other detention centers to continue being tortured or to work until death. Although the advance of both the Soviets and the Allies liberated concentration camps, preventing these crimes from remaining hidden, the marches continued until the end of the war. We can now hear the testimony of a survivor.
Salimos 1000 y pico y llegamos 300. ¿Llegamos a dónde, me vas a preguntar? El transporte de la muerte, yo únicamente en la marcha a la muerte, me acuerdo que otra vez utilicé mi política defensiva. No fui adelante, no fui atrás, no fui en el extremo izquierdo, en la extrema derecha ni extrema. Me mantenía dentro de lo posible amontonado con todo para no recibir un bayonetazo en el costado, para que no me maten atrás porque no puedo más.
The largest defensive line remaining to Germany outside of Berlin was the Seelow Heights, just 90 kilometers from the capital. Here, Soviet and Nazi troops clashed on April 16, 1945. The battle was one of the fiercest of the war and the last pitched battle. The Germans had a good defensive position thanks to the terrain, but the Russians greatly outnumbered them in men and tanks. After 3 days and despite the high number of casualties, the Red Army troops led by General Zhukov managed to break through the defenses. Berlin was now just one step away. On April 20th, the day Hitler turned 56, Soviet artillery began a terrible bombardment of the city. The citizens of Berlin, taken by surprise by the proximity of their enemy, panicked. They weren't the only ones. While German soldiers were ordered to resist to the death or be executed for cowardice, several high-ranking Nazi officers began to plan their escape. In an effort to create a positive image before their enemies, Himmler ordered on April 21st the release of around 20,000 Jews from some concentration camps. In a meeting with members of the World Jewish Congress a few days later, he lied, saying that the crematoria in these centers were built to dispose of the dead from a typhus epidemic. Furthermore, he claimed that these places had a high survival rate, although each person released showed evidence to the contrary. Through Swedish intermediaries, he posed as the provisional leader of Germany, declaring that Hitler would be dead in the coming days and sought to surrender to the Americans. Eisenhower rejected this request, calling Himmler Germany's greatest war criminal. Meanwhile, German troops tried to contain the advancing Soviet forces in the Berlin suburbs, but the small number of soldiers, the poor equipment they had, and the low morale could not withstand the Red Army. Hitler, with his most loyal staff and his lover Eva Braun, was in an underground bunker in the city center. The Führer was in a state of delirium and still imagined that victory was possible. He ordered General Steiner to launch a counterattack that, according to the Nazi leader, would put Zhukov's forces on the ropes. On April 22nd, when he was informed that Steiner did not have the men or materials for such a task, Hitler concluded that everything was indeed lost. In a fit of rage, he blamed his generals for incompetence and treason. Ignoring his men's pleas to flee the city, he declared that he would not leave Berlin until the battle was over. This tirade was portrayed in one of the most famous scenes of the 2004 movie, Downfall.
Steiner konnte nicht genügend Kräfte für einen Angriff massieren. Der Angriff Steiner ist nicht erfolgt.
By April 23rd, the Russians were at the gates of the city center. Just over 80,000 Germans, including army, SS, and militia, were facing off against 1.5 million Soviets energized by the imminent victory. The Nazis had no chance. Many, despite orders to fight to the end, laid down their weapons. Others, however, fueled by blind fanaticism, hindered the enemy's advance. Among them were members of the Hitler Youth, boys and girls indoctrinated from an early age to idolize their leader and give their lives for him. Tens of thousands of them died during the street fighting in Berlin. The German forces were not enough to stop the Soviet advance, and the siege of the city was completed. The Nazis were completely surrounded. Helmuth Weidling, the general in charge of the defense forces, pleaded with the Führer to order an attack to break the encirclement. Hitler turned a deaf ear, oscillating between imagining that everything would go well and moments of anguish when he realized there was no hope. In the following days, while desperate Germans fought with all they had, the Soviets gradually approached the government district of Berlin. We can now hear the words of a historian.
Hitler's subordinates are entirely divorced from the reality on the ground because Hitler is divorced from the reality on the ground. Hitler does not comprehend that two Soviet army groups are smashing into the center of Berlin.
On April 28th, a report from the BBC informed of Himmler's attempts to negotiate peace with the Allies. When Hitler found out, he flew into a terrible rage, declaring it the greatest betrayal he had ever known. He stripped the leader of the SS of all his ranks and ordered that he be shot. His representative in Berlin, Hermann Fegelein, had tried to flee some time before, but he was discovered and arrested. Upon learning of the disloyalty of someone he had considered his most faithful subject, Hitler ordered his death. Not even being Eva Braun's brother-in-law saved him. In the early hours of April 29th, Russian troops came face to face with the deteriorated Reichstag building, the former seat of the German government. Capturing it would hold a symbolic value for the Soviets, similar to what the fall of Paris was for the Nazis at the beginning of the war. But it wouldn't be easy. Inside were fanatical groups of SS troops with nothing to lose. They knew that falling into Soviet hands was almost a death sentence. After a day of fierce fighting, the red flag was raised on the building's terrace. At the same time the Reichstag fell into Soviet hands, just a kilometer away, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun in their underground bunker. The Führer knew the end was near. His last military order was to give Weidling permission to try to break the Russian siege. After poisoning his dog, he retired to his study with Eva Braun. Minutes later, the remaining personnel in the bunker heard a gunshot. On April 30th, 1945, the Nazi leader died. He had instructed his followers that his and his wife's corpses should be cremated and buried, as he didn't want his enemies to display them as war trophies. He sought to avoid the same fate as Mussolini, whose body had been mutilated by Italian partisans. Thus ended his 1,000-year Reich. It had lasted only 12, but it caused the deaths of over 75 million human beings. His remains would be discovered shortly afterward by the Soviets, although it wasn't until 1973 that they could confirm his identification. The Allies never found out, leading to various conspiracy theories claiming Hitler was still alive. They gained access to this information after the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's now listen to the testimony of a historian speaking about this.
Почему Сталин не сообщает союзникам?
Warum ließ Stalin seine Verbündeten im Dunkeln?
Здесь больше психологии,
Das ist
может
etwas
быть, чем,
kompliziert und hat psychologische
формальной
Gründe.
логики. Psychologisch,
Ein Wissensvorsprung ist
знать
stets
то,
von
что не
Vorteil.
знают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Es kann immer nützlich sein, ein
Обладать тайной,
Geheimnis zu
которой не
haben.
обладают другие, это всегда хорошо.
Hitler's successor was his friend and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. The new chancellor rejected the Soviet demand for unconditional surrender, ordering the battered and few remaining German troops that Berlin must be defended to the last drop of blood. One day after the Führer's death, Goebbels and his wife poisoned their 6 children with cyanide while they slept. Then they committed suicide, gunshot. Their bodies were also burned. With Goebbels off the stage, perhaps the last staunch fan of the Nazi Party, Weidling saw no reason for his men to continue fighting a lost war. On the morning of May 2nd, the German troops laid down their arms. Thus, the Battle of Berlin came to an end. It left a balance of approximately 80,000 Soviet and 100,000 German dead. the civilians who lost their lives were more than 120,000. The Red Army, hungry for revenge for the brutal actions of the Nazis in their territory, committed atrocities against the population. In addition to the multiple looting and destruction, it is estimated that between 90 and 130,000 women were raped in Berlin. Many thousands would end up committing due to the trauma caused. The city also faced a food shortage that the Soviets could not solve. Due to the havoc caused by bombing and urban battle, more than 1 million people had been left homeless. Let's listen to the testimony of a German survivor below.
And then they came downstairs to the basement, putting this cardboard on the table, telling the people in Berlin, Väterchen Stalin gave his troops the right to rape, to steal, to kill, to do whatever they want to do. And believe me, they did.
The Axis forces would continue fighting in the remaining conquered territories until May 8th, with the unconditional surrender of Germany on this day. After 6 long and bloody years, the war in Europe was over. But there was still work to be done on this front. Hundreds of Nazi generals and leaders had fallen into the hands of their enemies. Most of these would be tried in Nuremberg, but some had escaped. With Hitler and Goebbels dead, Heinrich Himmler became the most wanted by the Allied forces. After the failure of his attempts to achieve peace, he sought to hide from both the Allies and the Nazis. He changed his appearance, cutting his hair and mustache, hiding his glasses, and putting on a black eye patch. He posed as Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, a secret police agent who he himself had ordered shot for defeatism. Still in Germany, he was stopped at a checkpoint by 2 Soviets who suspected there was something strange about his behavior. On May 23, 1945, he handed him over to the British, and after routine interrogation, Himmler revealed his true identity. He insisted on speaking with the Allied leaders, but his requests fell on deaf ears. When a doctor was ordered to give him a checkup, Himmler bit down on the cyanide capsule he had hidden in his mouth. Within 15 minutes, he was lifeless. With Himmler's and the capture of other high-ranking leaders such as Hermann Göring and Karl Dönitz, the leadership of the Third Reich had collapsed. Despite what the German surrender meant, the atmosphere in the Reich capital was not happy. Unlike many other regions under Nazi control, Berlin was not liberated but conquered. There were no scenes of emotional celebrations, nor soldiers being welcomed with kisses and flowers. The remaining citizens now had to deal with mourning their dead and rebuilding their lives under the tense joint Allied and Soviet occupation. Still, many Berliners were relieved that the war was finally over, at least on their territory, and that the regime that had plunged them into it was in ruins. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the best-known battles of World War II, and certainly one of the most important. For almost 200 days, Germans and Soviets faced each other in a destroyed city, in inhumane conditions. The winter cold, extreme hunger, and epidemic diseases killed almost as many people as bullets or explosives. The combat, which began with tanks and aerial bombardment, was quickly reduced to hand-to-hand combat, where people fought with bayonets, shovels, and bare fists. Every room was a fortress to be conquered. Both sides knew that whoever emerged victorious in this conflict would be one step closer to achieving final victory. In fact, the orders coming from their leaders were clear. Surrender was forbidden. They had to fight until the last drop of blood. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Stalingrad, the most brutal battle of World War II.
Dieses Gefühl habe ich heute immer noch. Die waren alle so jung und so lebensfreudig. Es waren auch schon ein paar Ältere dabei, aber gelebt hat jeder gerne. Und ich sage es ganz offen und ehrlich, ich bin von Stalingrad rausgekommen, aber so richtig von Herzen drüber freuen kann ich mich nicht, weil ich immer wieder daran denken muss.
The action that led to this bloody battle was Operation Barbarossa. This was the name given to the massive German invasion of Soviet territory that began on June 22, 1941. The Nazis' goal was to defeat their enemies in one swift and brutal blow, thanks to their blitzkrieg strategy. Hitler and his generals viewed the Red Army as a body of poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers, led by inexperienced military personnel. Although the Russians greatly outnumbered them, the Germans were confident that their superior tactics would bring them victory. Let's listen to a historian talking about the Führer's reasons for invading the Soviet Union.
Adolf Hitler es uno de los hombres más estudiados de la historia y uno de los más malvados. Pensaba que la naturaleza fundamental de la lucha humana era la lucha entre las razas. Para él, la Unión Soviética unía los dos peores males. En sus propias palabras, el bolchevismo y el judaísmo, y era la mayor amenaza para la raza aria.
The attack was divided into three fronts. The Northern Army Corps would aim for the city of Leningrad. In the center, they would advance to take Moscow, the capital of the Union. In the south, German and Allied troops were to conquer the fertile Ukrainian fields and the oil-rich territory of the Caucasus. Depriving the Soviets of this source of energy basically guaranteed German victory, since their tanks and planes, among other vehicles, would be unusable. In addition, the capture of all this land expansion would serve the Nazis to expand what they called Lebensraum, or living space. This was the name given to the area required by the Aryan man for his survival, which, according to the party, was threatened by his neighbors. The other side of the coin was that the Slavic population native to these desired areas had to be exterminated, since coexistence between the Germans and these peoples was seen as impossible. For the first few months, the invasion went almost exactly as Hitler had planned. Soviet troops were overwhelmed by the German blitzkrieg and forced to give up large tracts of land in a very short time. Their soldiers were falling in droves, and their vehicles were destroyed by the hundreds. By the end of 1941, the Axis armies were close to achieving their objectives. Leningrad was under siege, fierce fighting was raging around Moscow, and much of Ukraine had already been conquered. Although the advance slowed down at the end of the year, that is, during the winter, Hitler was confident of a quick victory that would guarantee the end of the Soviet Union and the dominance of the Reich. But in both the north and the center, the situation became more complicated than expected. Despite the brutal siege, the city of Leningrad did not fall, and never would. On the other hand, Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, had taken special interest in ensuring that Moscow was not in Nazi hands under any circumstances. Russian counterattacks concentrated on this city and were so ferocious that they marked the first major defeat of German forces in the war, inflicting significant losses in men and equipment. Thus, with the front bogged down in these two regions, for the spring 1942 campaign, Hitler focused his operations on the south. With the Ukrainian countryside already conquered, the next German objective was the Caucasus. But to get there, Stalingrad had to be taken first. This city controlled access to the Volga River, which served as a key communication route for the entire Soviet Union. It was also an important industrial center for the country, with a large number of factories producing various types of equipment. But beyond these economic and logistical aspects, conquering the city that bore the name of the Soviet leader would have a very important ideological value. In a statement to his generals, Hitler had said that after Stalingrad was under his control, the entire male population was to be eliminated, since they were completely communist. Women and children were to be deported into the interior of the Reich and put to forced labor. The brutality, however, had begun long before the arrival, as recounted by a Soviet soldier in the following video.
Los alemanes lanzaban panfletos con la siguiente leyenda: pequeños demonios de Stalin, luchad contra vuestros comandantes, rendíos o de lo contrario seréis destruidos. Uno de aquellos días, la distancia entre líneas era de 300 metros. Los alemanes anunciaban por sus altavoces: mirad lo que os pasará si no os rendís. Vimos cómo sacaban a 4 personas medio desnudas de su fortificación y las fusilaban.
Following the failure of the Moscow campaign, the Führer had appointed himself supreme commander of the military forces. Overruling more experienced generals, he divided the Southern Army Corps into 2. One group would continue to advance toward the Caucasus, while the other would attack Stalingrad. Realizing what the Germans were planning to do, Stalin, who had imagined that his enemy would focus on the capital, began to order the mobilization of troops toward the city that bore his name. He also refused to evacuate the approximately 400,000 civilians, since he needed them to continue working in the factories and helping the Soviet war effort. It is also said that he did not do so because he thought that this would make the Red Army soldiers fight more fervently to defend their own. What he did move was a large part of the grain and livestock reserves into the interior of the country. While this deprived the Germans of any potential access to these food sources, the same thing happened to their own people. On August 23, 1942, the German 6th Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, was on the outskirts of Stalingrad. The battle began with a brutal bombing of the city by the Luftwaffe, the Nazi Air Force. 1,000 tons of bombs, many of them incendiary, were dropped in just 2 days. 90% of homes were destroyed in this first attack alone. Civilian casualties were extremely high, estimated at 40,000. Those who were able to escape were captured by the invaders and deported to Germany. Despite the destruction, industries that were not reduced to rubble continued to produce goods and equipment. Tanks were finished and launched into combat on the same day. By the time the initial bombing raids ended, the city was unrecognizable. Explosives and fire had turned Stalingrad into a ruin. However, there was still much to be done. Ground fighting quickly broke out between attackers and defenders. German tanks rolled through the sea of rubble, while the Soviets engaged them with improvised weapons. Civilians not working in the factories were sent to fight at the front, sometimes without rifles. Women, who had originally served in the army in support roles as nurses or administrative staff, were now an important part of the defending forces. In one of these early engagements, a regiment partially staffed by women engaged German battleships with anti-aircraft batteries. By the end of the engagement, they had incurred a heavy toll, with 28 enemy tanks destroyed. the Russians fought with a ferocity that surprised the invaders, who imagined that by now they would be close to collapse. This is what a veteran of this conflict tells us below.
At the time, we firmly believed that Germans would kill us in any case. And this very fact drove us to fight until the end. And we did, each one of us in his own way. We were doing what we were supposed to do.
However, this did not mean that the Germans were defeated. On the contrary, although the fighting was intense and there were heavy casualties on both sides, the attackers had the upper hand. By the last days of August, they had almost completely taken control of the Volga River. To deliver resources to the overstretched defenders, the Soviets' only option was through incredibly dangerous water crossings. Harassed by artillery and aircraft, most of these efforts ended in disaster. In September, urban combat intensified. Stalin's men continually counterattacked the Germans. Although these operations were disorganized and not very successful, they did serve to delay the Nazi advance. Every factory, building, and house was now fought over. Fighting often came down to hand-to-hand combat because both sides were so close together. The Germans, while still logistically superior, were beginning to realize how difficult it would be to take the city. One Reich officer even said that France had surrendered in less time than it took to take a single factory in Stalingrad. The invaders' morale was falling, while Soviet propaganda in its publications was praising the heroic defenders of the city. Ironically, the Nazis' thirst for destruction worked against them. The immense amount of rubble made it difficult for their tanks to move, making one of their greatest advantages over the Red Army ineffective. In this rat war, as the Germans bitterly called it, snipers on both sides began to take on a role. While the infantry fought fiercely in a building, for example, one of these soldiers waited patiently for a high-ranking officer to poke his head out. Women who, as mentioned, were already employed as combatants in the Red Army were in high demand for this position. Their generally smaller bodies made for a silhouette that was harder for enemies to discern. In addition to officers, the targets of these men and women were often soldiers tasked with bringing supplies, such as ammunition, water, or food to the front. The best-known sniper of the Battle of Stalingrad, not to mention in war history, was Vasily Zaitsev. He is credited with 225 enemy kills. He was used as a heroic symbol by Soviet propaganda, which recounted, and sometimes exaggerated, his exploits. This was often the case with other such skilled men and women, as a former German soldier recounts in the following video.
Das haben wir eben festgestellt, der Russe hatte aber eben zu dieser Zeit schon auf Scharfschützen erheblich mehr Wert gelegt und der hatte tatsächlich die Ausrüstung mit Zielfernrohren, war bei dem Russen zweifellos zu dieser Zeit damals, wie wir dann feststellten, wohl stärker und größer als bei uns. Dazu kommt noch, dass wir jetzt festgestellt haben, dass der Russe diese Scharfschützen bei ihren Erfolgen auch rein aus propagandistischen Gründen besonders hochgehoben und als Helden gefeiert hat.
The exploitation of urban tactics gave the defenders an advantage, although their situation remained extremely difficult. The Soviets, in order to reduce their casualties, began to attack at night, using the city's sewers to move behind enemy lines. This prevented the Germans from sleeping peacefully, as they never knew when the Russian bullets would start flying. Buildings were mined, abandoned houses were booby-trapped, and tanks were hidden among the ruins. In this way, the invaders were constantly taken by surprise. Both sides began to use the strategy of outnumbering the enemy, launching massive attacks regardless of the number of dead or collateral damage. But the Nazis were isolated. The rest of the armies were on the Eastern Front, busy with other engagements. On the other hand, the Soviets were constantly receiving reinforcements, which seemed to have no end. The battle continued for months, with the dead piling up on both sides. By the end of November 1942, the Germans controlled 90% of Stalingrad. The locals had been driven to a small, albeit highly fortified strip of land. But now a factor was about to enter the picture that would determine the fate of this conflict. The dreaded Russian winter was fast approaching. While it froze the waters of the Volga, rendering the Red Army unable to reinforce its men, the weather would have far more severe consequences for the invaders. The extreme cold, coupled with hunger and epidemic disease, killed almost as many Germans as Russian weapons. The temperature could reach 40 degrees below zero, causing many men to lose body parts to frostbite. Those who died of hypothermia had become a macabre decoration on the battlefront. Because of the number of those affected, German medicines quickly ran out, and surgeries had to be performed without anesthesia. While hunger hurt both sides, the Soviets were better prepared for these conditions. Still, soldiers on both fronts and civilians were forced to take extreme measures to survive, such as eating mud and snow. Seeing that the Germans were ill-prepared, the Soviet High Command finally set its plans in motion. Since August 1942, forces had been massing in the steppes north and south of Stalingrad for an eventual attack. Marshal Zhukov, one of the Red Army's most senior officers, and in charge of the city's defense, noted that the German flanks were weakened. These were largely made up of Romanian and Hungarian soldiers, allies of Germany, but without its training and experience. Earlier, Nazi General Paulus had asked the Führer for permission to reinforce these areas, but Hitler had refused, as not even an inch of ground could be conceded to the enemy. With the onset of winter, Zhukov saw his opportunity. Wasting no time, the Soviet counteroffensive was launched against these lines on November 19th, under the name Operation Uranus, in 2 simultaneous attacks. The weakened Axis forces were overwhelmed by the emboldened soldiers of the Red Army, having been taken by surprise. Their responses were chaotic and poorly planned. In addition, the bad weather made the German Air Force ineffective against the attackers. Stalin's tanks ran over the troops of the German allies, which were mostly made up of infantry. Below we can hear how this operation was planned.
La Operación Urano fue el esfuerzo soviético por cerrar el círculo para aplicar 2 pinzas masivas, una por el norte y otra por el sur. Los soviéticos sabían que las líneas alemanas eran débiles y pronto las atravesaron.
On November 23rd, the 2 prongs of the Soviet attack linked up, completely encircling Paulus's 6th Army. Some 265,000 men were now trapped by the Russian ring. The cold reached its most extreme temperatures, with men dying by the hundreds each day. Despite the hopelessness of their position, the trapped Germans were not allowed to try to break out of the encirclement. Stalingrad could not be abandoned under any circumstances. The Nazis attempted to break this encirclement with the armies that had managed to escape the trap through Operation Winter Storm. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe would airlift supplies to the desperate German soldiers. But the numbers they needed were enormous. 700 tons of supplies per day were needed to keep the fight going. For more than 2 months, planes dropped food, medicine, and ammunition, but they never reached the quantities the troops needed. Even useless objects were sometimes thrown in, such as 4 tons of pepper and thousands of propaganda leaflets. The failure of both the relief operation and the attempts to break the encirclement made the German situation critical. They could no longer even bury their dead. Every day, cold, epidemics, thirst, and hunger claimed the lives of hundreds of people. The seriously wounded were no longer treated, and orders were given to shoot only when they were sure of hitting the target, so as not to waste ammunition. Many Germans committed suicide in these dark days, seeing that there was no escape from their situation. Paulus knew that the chances of a Nazi victory were zero. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets contacted the German general to give him the opportunity to surrender. But Hitler's orders remained the same. They had to fight to the last man. So Paulus was forced to continue fighting. On January 22nd, the Red Army captured the only remaining German airbase, preventing further supplies from arriving. The German leader contacted the Führer again to reiterate his call for capitulation. Hitler instead promoted him to field marshal. Now, if Paulus surrendered, he would be the only one of that rank in German history to do so. It was, in essence, an invitation to suicide to save the Reich's honor. However, the general had no intention of complying. On February 2nd, just as a new attack collapsed on the defenders, Paulus surrendered to Soviet forces. Of the nearly 300,000 men who had been surrounded, 91,000 remained in appalling conditions. Many of them could barely move and died while being transported to prisoner of war camps. Paulus, furious with Hitler's senseless orders, became one of his most vocal whistleblowers from Moscow. You can see footage of the mass surrender below.
The hammer and sickle of the Red Army completely broke down the enemy's will to fight, and the Russians are reaping the reward of their gigantic efforts as at point after point, whole detachments of German troops give themselves up. Now the white flag of capitulation has taken the place of the crooked cross.
From the beginning of the battle to its end, an estimated 2 million people lost their lives, including Axis troops, Soviet soldiers, and civilians. It was the bloodiest and longest battle of the entire Second World War. It was also one of the most important. It marked the turning point of the conflict, as Germany would never recover from this defeat and would enter into a retreat that would last until its surrender in Berlin. In 1944, Paris, considered one of the most beautiful cities in the world, was completely in the hands of the Nazis. Its citizens had already endured 4 years of occupation, 4 years of suffering at the hands of the Germans and their collaborators. But the winds were changing. The Allies had invaded Europe and were defeating the German forces. The crisis of the Germans was visible to all. The French people, always known for their resilience, felt inspired to achieve their long-awaited liberation, with or without Allied help. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about one of the most inspiring events, which occurred during one of the darkest moments in history, the liberation of Paris in full color. For many historians, the fall of France in 1940 was the event where the world became aware of what was to come. The French command and its allies had underestimated Adolf Hitler, and consequently, the country was in his hands. From here, The German government had ample freedom of movement for its conquest campaign, leaving the Allied forces without a strong foothold in continental Europe. France was soon divided, with one half occupied, while the other saw the establishment of the Vichy puppet state. The City of Light fell within the occupied half. The government headquarters shifted to the city of Vichy, but the conquest of the former capital held undeniable symbolic value. Hitler, who considered Paris the most beautiful city in the world, wasted no time in celebrating his victory by touring it. He was seen on the Champs-Élysées, the Arc de Triomphe, and obviously the Eiffel Tower. Let's now watch a video of the Führer strolling with his men through the newly conquered city. The citizens were subjected to rationing of food and other goods, a curfew that forbade movement in the city at night, and the takeover of the media by the Germans, who began circulating propaganda in their favor. Any Parisian who dared to rebel was harshly suppressed. Nevertheless, the Nazis could not prevent the emergence of civilian resistance. These individuals, called maquis, formed clandestine groups that took sabotage actions against the invaders, sometimes even attacking their officers. Some of them were communists, while others were loyal to General Charles de Gaulle, who served as the leader of Free France. Despite their different loyalties, they were united in their goal of expelling the Germans from the City of Light. However, they would have to wait a long time for an opportunity. Next, you'll hear the words of a resistance member explaining why they joined the movement.
Si quelqu'un vient chez vous, vous tape dessus, vide votre frigo, bat les gosses et casse tout, qu'est-ce que vous faites si vous êtes quelqu'un d'honorable? Vous les fiches dehors. Hein? Ben, moi, les Allemands, je voulais les fiches d'or. Et la seule façon de les fiches d'or, c'est de les tuer.
The opportunity for the French would come 4 years later. Following the successful Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, the Allies were advancing rapidly into the interior of France. The Germans, desperate, tried by all means to control the advance of their enemies, but they were disorganized, and cities that they had conquered years ago were being liberated by Allied forces. Hitler had ordered that only he would make all military decisions, so the Germans were forced to wait for information to reach Berlin and then return to the front. Thus, while they yielded more and more territory, they found themselves cornered by the troops led by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower. In the Falaise Pocket, almost 2 entire German armies were cornered. Desperate, they were forced to retreat in broad daylight at the mercy of Allied aircraft fire. 50,000 men were captured, and although many tens of thousands were able to escape, they had to leave their tanks and heavy weaponry behind. They no longer had any hope of halting the advance of their enemies. You can see below the testimonies of a German soldier and an American soldier narrating the frantic German escape from the Allied encirclement.
Many stopped in their tracks and tried to find cover, but it wasn't possible because the fire came from all sides.
We were attacking German tank concentrations. It was a continuous attack with very effective results.
Perhaps surprisingly, in the initial plans of the Allies, the liberation of Paris may not have been considered. Entering this city would have slowed down the march towards Berlin, the main objective of the invasion of Europe. Additionally, all the resources required to liberate and protect Paris could have been used on other fronts to bring about the enemy's downfall more quickly. Flanking the city and continuing to advance would have left the Nazi garrison installed in the city isolated from the support of the German army. For these reasons, the liberation of Paris did not present a strategic advantage. The French didn't agree with this analysis. They couldn't wait for the fall of Berlin. They needed to expel the invaders from their capital city and destroy the collaborationist Vichy regime. Upon hearing the news of the Allied advance, Parisians were emboldened, sensing that their liberation was near. On August 15, 1944, employees of the Paris Metro and the police decided not to show up for work. 3 days later, workers across the country, led by the French Communist Party, joined in, declaring a general strike. German soldiers suppressed the French employees. There were casualties, but the strike persisted. Meanwhile, Radios and newspapers controlled by the French forces of the interior called for a popular civil insurrection. The German garrison, although still significant, was not as numerous, as some troops were fighting on the French front, while others had been withdrawn to protect German territory from a possible future invasion. On August 19th, while the Allied troops still hesitated to enter Paris, real skirmishes began between German soldiers and the French population. Members of the police seized the prefecture and began firing at the occupying forces. Men, women, and children erected barricades in the streets, hindering the movement of Nazi vehicles. Third Reich banners were lowered and replaced by the tricolor flag. Amidst the gunfire, people sang the Marseillaise. The French forces of the interior ordered citizens, "Everyone to the barricades." The liberation of Paris did not begin with an attack by the Allies, but with the uprising of its own people. One day later, the military governor of Paris, Dietrich von Choltitz, negotiated a ceasefire with the French resistance. Unaware that the Allies were planning to bypass the city, Choltitz ordered several of his troops to withdraw, seeing it as unlikely that they could successfully defend the city. However, several partisan groups ignored the ceasefire and attacks continued. On August 22nd, the fighting in Paris intensified. The Germans began to counterattack, openly firing at the civilian population. The Grand Palais, which served as a stronghold for the resistance, was fired upon while tanks cleared the barricades. On August 23rd, Adolf Hitler, furious about the course of the war, ordered Choltitz to inflict maximum damage on the city. He preferred to see one of his favorite cities burn rather than fall into the hands of his enemies. Explosives were placed on numerous bridges and monuments throughout the city. Upon learning that the French resistance was rising against their oppressors, de Gaulle urged American Commander Eisenhower to begin a frontal attack on Paris. The French leader did not want the citizens of Paris to suffer the same fate as the Polish resistance in the Warsaw Uprising, where the Soviets had not come to the aid of the partisans, and they were being crushed by the Nazis. De Gaulle warned Eisenhower that if the rebels were not assisted, the Germans would annihilate them. Additionally, if the rebellion was not intervened in, the French communists would see their position strengthened as they were taking over the leadership of the insurgency. The French even threatened to ignore the chain of command and attack the German garrison solely with their forces if the Allies did not comply with their request. However, despite sympathizing with the Parisian population, Eisenhower turned a deaf ear to his comrades' complaints. On August 24th, General Philippe Leclerc, with de Gaulle's permission, disobeyed his American superior and sent the vanguard of his 2nd Armored Division to Paris. They engaged in combat with the entrenched German troops on the outskirts, forcing them to retreat. Leclerc's insubordinate maneuver forced the hand of the Allies. Believing he could not stop the French from liberating their capital, Eisenhower ordered the other divisions to assist the soldiers of Free France. Meanwhile, civilians celebrated Leclerc's entry. They sang the national anthem, accompanied the tanks' march, and bells rang in the churches. Soldiers received kisses, flowers, and bottles of wine. You can see below the testimonies of military and civilians from those days.
They had set up an old-fashioned record player, the kind with the big flared horn. And a man came out and he started La Marseillaise.
And my grandmother at that time called me, and she had prepared a basket with fresh and raw apples in it. So I took that and I gave it to him, and I had my first chocolate that day.
Wonderful, wonderful. They give you a kiss and hug, and they give you the wine. They had some of the best wine that you can drink too, So it was a joyous time.
On the morning of August 25th, Allied troops continued to advance. Leclerc's division entered through the Porte d'Orléans, while La Neuve, a company mostly composed of Republican veterans from the Spanish Civil War, entered through the Porte d'Italie. The Americans, led by General Leonard T. Jarrow, followed shortly after, heading to the Paris City Hall to reinforce the resistance of the French forces of the interior. Choltitz knew he had no chance of defending the city. Most of his troops had withdrawn, leaving only 20,000 soldiers who now faced not only the Allies, but also 3 million empowered Parisians hungry for freedom. The main dilemma for the German general lay elsewhere. Should he obey the Führer and destroy Paris, or would he disobey? While he decided what to do, he informed his superiors of non-existent maneuvers, although the idea of surrender was already forming in his mind. Supposedly, at the same time that the Allied attack advanced towards the city center, Hitler called Choltitz and asked, "Is Paris burning?" His response is not known. In the afternoon, Choltitz's headquarters was assaulted, and the German commander was taken prisoner. Around 3 p.m., in front of General Leclerc, Choltitz signed the surrender of the German occupation forces. After 4 long years, Paris was free. Choltitz, for disobeying Hitler's orders, became known as the Savior of Paris. According to him, destroying the city would have been an evil and shameful act against a city that is a cradle of culture. However, the French resistance declared that executions and repressions against the Parisian population continued until just hours before the surrender of the German contingent. For them, the city was saved because Choltitz knew that a Nazi victory was impossible and did not want himself and his men to suffer possible reprisals from the Maquis. The streets of the city exploded in scenes of celebration. Entire blocks were turned into dance floors, music played for entire nights, kisses were freely given to the liberators and the resistance fighters without any restraint. Charles de Gaulle addressed the French people on the radio and delivered a speech that will be remembered for posterity. Let's listen to a well-known excerpt from it below, allowing us to use a black and white video, as its epicness is worth it.
Paris, Paris outragé, Paris brisé, Paris martyrisé, mais Paris libéré, libéré par lui-même, libéré par son peuple avec le concours des armées de la France, avec l'appui et le concours de la France tout entière, c'est-à-dire de la France qui se bat, c'est-à-dire de la seule France, de la vraie France, de la France éternelle.
However, we must say not everything was a celebration those days. The Nazi occupation in France left serious and deep wounds in its population. Since its invasion in 1940, hundreds of thousands of French citizens were forcibly taken to Germany, made to work in factories, farms, railways, etc., to benefit the Nazi war effort. The Germans also seized around 20% of French food production, leading to widespread food shortages. 49 concentration camps were built on French soil, where the Jewish population was sent. Over 77,000 died during the war, nearly a quarter of its total population. All these crimes led to French retaliation shortly after liberation. The Nazis who had occupied Paris had already withdrawn, or had been taken prisoner, so the vengeance fell upon the collaborators. Women accused of consorting with the Germans were violently shaved and publicly displayed for the amusement of others. Informers, merchants who conducted business with the invaders, writers, and journalists who advocated collaboration were in many cases executed without trial by French civilians and partisans. Sometimes the severity of the act didn't seem to matter, and mere suspicion was enough for condemnation. It is estimated that in the days following the liberation of Paris, the resistance murdered 20,000 people in French territory. For many, these acts of retribution were not far removed from the atrocities committed by the Germans, and were a stain on what was the glorious liberation of Paris. For others, they were completely justified, as each of the executed individuals collaborated with the regime that terrorized not only France, but almost the entire world. There were also political trials. Philippe Pétain, hero of the First World War where he earned the nickname Lion of Verdun, was the one who signed the armistice with Germany in 1940. In his words, to prevent the destruction of France's rich heritage, he urged the people to collaborate with the Germans. He was found guilty of treason, and only de Gaulle's personal intervention prevented his execution. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his days in prison. Pierre Laval, the Prime Minister of Vichy France, was not so lucky. After the war, he was executed by firing squad. For most French people, August 25th was a glorious day. In the days that followed, the Allies marched with their victorious troops throughout Paris, starting from the Arc de Triomphe and proceeding down the Champs-Élysées. It is estimated that 2 million people witnessed the parade, 2/3 of the city's population. De Gaulle's victory legitimized his provisional government, replacing the fallen Vichy France and uniting communists, anarchists, nationalists, and others under his banner, at least for a time. Below, we can see the people's celebrations in the recovered streets of Paris.
The thrilling music of the Marseillaise takes on new meaning. Deliverance has come so suddenly to these people, they are slow to realize the nightmare of occupation is over. This is but a foretaste of things to come as the Allies move forward. The V for victory sign, once the symbol of a hope, is now a reality.
While Paris was free, much of France still remained in the hands of the Germans. Resistance pockets persisted in the country until the end of the war. But, just as the fall of the city was a harbinger of the dark years to come, its liberation appeared as the light at the end of a long and distressing tunnel. We've reached the end of the video, and we'd like to ask you, do you believe the actions of the resistance towards collaborators were justified? Leave your answer in the comment section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.